Leaders' Questions with Gilroy and Stuart Lancaster.
In association with Goal.
From Off the Ball.
And you're very welcome along to this week's Leaders' Questions with Stuart Lancaster. Our guest this week is the former Welsh coach, Kevin Bowring, who's also had a massive tract of his career helping to develop coaches for the RFU in England, and is also back working as a consultant with the Welsh Rugby Union. Stuart, this one's fairly obvious crossover between yourself and Kevin. His time at the RFU dovetails very nicely with yours, and you've cited him as a major influence in your career.
Yeah, I mean, they did dovetail, but part of the reason I went to the RFU was because of Kevin in the first place. So my career, as you know, we've talked about in the past, went from teaching to academy manager. So at the age of 30, I was the academy manager, so I was working outside of the RFU. But I went on various coaching courses, and Kevin helped me get onto what was the level 5 coaching course when I was 32. Kevin ran that programme for the RFU. And that gave me a huge development in terms of leadership and management, as well as coaching rugby. So I then stayed on and was mentored effectively by Kev over the next 2 or 3 years, and then an opportunity came up in the RFU in 2007, and I joined the RFU, and Kevin was obviously already there, and he was certainly a big part to play in me joining the RFU. And then obviously from the 4 years I was the Saxon coach and running the academy programme and the international age group programme, Kevin and I worked side by side, trying to help the development of coaches and leadership within the game. Then obviously I become the England interim coach and the head coach, and Kevin obviously supported me, as a mentor effectively during that period, right the way through to and after the World Cup, and we've stayed in contact ever since.
Kevin, for a lot of mentors, good morning to you, by the way, and thanks very much for taking the call. For a lot of mentors, sometimes mentorship can be a little bit of a projection, but for you, you had actually walked in the exact same shoes almost as Stuart. You'd come through a very similar pathway yourself to get the Wales job.
Yeah, I did. I suppose we were both teachers originally, so I started off as a PE teacher, and while I was teaching, I was fortunate to be offered the Wales under-21 coaching role, and I did that for 3 years. Then I did the Wales A team for 3 years. And then the game went professional in September 1995, and I actually got appointed as full-time national coach of the Welsh national team then in November 95, and did 3 years as national coach there before realizing I was probably a better coach developer and a developer of coaches rather than a developer of players, perhaps.
I was actually doing a little bit of reading about that, and there was a piece of work that you'd done about what the pathway for coaches within Wales should be, and you'd given this to the Welsh board, and they just weren't ready for it at that time. You end up going to England, and I'd say fairly much implementing the plan that you'd put together. So it was obviously something that had always been in your mind about how coaches need coached. It's like leadership is a muscle, and it needs to be trained, and if you don't do it properly, well, then you're not really helping your coaches to develop or to become leaders. What was the genesis of that plan? When did you become fascinated and interested in the topic as opposed to just rugby?
I suppose it's lonely at the top, and when you become the head coach, when the buck really stops with you, where do you go for learning? Because everybody thinks the national coach knows everything. While if you're open, hungry, and open to learning, then where do you go to get that stimulation, that support, that challenge, that sharing to think out loud with someone, basically? I think Bill Bezic referred to himself as a thinking partner, Stuart, with you previously. And thinking out loud with someone helps that person come up with the right decision for them at that moment. They're responsible and accountable for it. That's why I quite like the term a critical thinking friend or a critical thinking partner rather than a mentor, because you can think out loud with someone who you trust, who's a friend or someone at least that you can trust and open up to. Think out loud go through some questioning with that to clarify what's the best solution to the problem that you're facing there and then, because you're responsible and accountable for it, not me, a thinking partner.
Yeah, that's this is something we may as well delve into at the moment, because good ideas aren't always your first idea. Frequently, your first idea is a really bad idea, and having somebody to, say, well, okay, let's think about that a bit, isn't actually the worst thing to have in your life.
I think it was a two-stage process for me. I think it was giving the theory behind the practice and the tools to help me make the right decision, and then someone to reflect on my decision-making, if you like. Does that make sense? So what Kevin helped me with, in particular, was he gave me access to other coaches, to other resources, to other leadership content. I was on the Ashridge business course and some great lectures there that we had and some great people to interact with. And Kevin would always he put me in as a attached coach with England 20s, so I could watch and observe international rugby. He took me to the Six Nations coaching conference in France, where there were 6 coaches from all the 6 countries in the Six Nations, 36 coaches. So, it was fantastic, learning environment. So it was a sort of that process for me to develop my own leadership philosophy and understanding was definitely hugely influenced by what Kev gave me, not just Kevin himself, but the people he put me in front of and the way he created the opportunities for me. And then secondly, once I'd got that clear in my mind and I'd gone through the process of, say, coaching Leeds Tykes first team, I'd gone into the Championship and the Premiership, then he was there to, okay, now how's it going? And obviously with Kev's been there, he's coached Wales at the highest level, and obviously as I stepped into that England coaching role, he was there all the time to mentor. So I think it's two things. It's to develop a leadership, you have to give them the tools to do that, and then you need to then provide a mentor to support them.
It's interesting just to go back, and this is a bit random, but when you were at a coaching conference of the Six Nations and the 36 coaches, are people being honest about their own coaching philosophies? Are they telling the truth? And that's a bit, people listening will be like, hang on a second, how does that work?
Yeah, no, they are very, very open.
And why? Why are they being open? Why are they not
I just think everyone who goes to those conferences has got a growth mindset and a mindset to want to share and learn and from each other. I think I've met quite a few coaches who, do courses to tick the box and feel like they've got to get some form of accreditation, but they're never the ones who really progress in my mind.
Are they ever protective over what they might see as intellectual property? Or
Yeah, no, you should be surprised actually how open and honest people are. And I think people generally are of the mindset that if you give a bit, you're going to get something back in return. And Wayne Smith, the New Zealand coach, he'd be definitely like that. I mean, it was interesting because that particular conference, I'd just taken over as head coach in the Championship, and Leeds had been relegated. We'd lost all the players. There were 7 players left. And we had to get promoted to the Premiership in the first time, and Bill Bezic actually was sort of leading the conference, and he said, would anyone like to share any coaching challenges? And I looked around the room, I thought, no one's going to put a hand up here, so I went, I've got a challenge, and Kev, I'm sure Kev remembers it, but, problem shared is a problem halved.
That you got good information, people helped, like in that.
Yeah, I mean, I had my own clarity. I was happy to share what I was planning on doing. I think people were just interested in my own style and philosophy.
Yeah.
But I've always had that mindset to want to, even now, coaching Leinster, I'll be studying the Six Nations, I'll be watching Super Rugby, I'll be reading the next book that's available, and all that mindset, is a direct result of the support and challenge that people like Kev gave me.
Well, we could talk about some practicalities, Kevin. We're very keen to give people a bit of a toolbook, or at least an introduction to what they need to be doing in practical terms to develop and evolve leadership. And an issue that came up last week, so we're recording this just after the Six Nations is over. Rory Best announced during the tournament that he wouldn't be returning as Ireland captain probably after the World Cup. And then that sparked a conversation about who should be next. And during the middle of it, Brian O'Driscoll said that he felt he was actually a little bit too young at the start to be the Ireland captain, that it took him a little while to get used to all of the stuff that goes with being captain, despite the fact he was clearly the leader of the team on the field. I wonder, in retrospect, if loads of people don't end up in leadership roles a little bit too early for them, and if their lives and careers would be a bit different. Obviously, it worked out okay for him, it worked out okay for Sam Warburton, you could argue as well. But what are the practical things that you would be telling somebody who is young, who's in a leadership position, about what they need to be doing to become better more consistent, more coherent leaders?
I mean, there are lots of leadership models, leadership styles, leadership theories, and I actually think there's. I'm not an academic and I'm not a theorist. I'm a practitioner, really, but I like the theory behind good practice, because if you know the theory behind why you're good, perhaps you put more emphasis on being even more effective then. And I think the sort of transformational leadership behaviors are great examples of behaviors that are effective in a leadership situation. So there are 4 behaviors. So first one is idealized influence. That means you exert influence by demonstrating, role modeling the behaviors that the team values, the values of the organization, the values of the team. So it's leading by doing. It's just do it. It's the just follow me. This is the behavior we want. Then there's the inspirational motivator, the talking leader, the leader who says the right thing in the right moment, who is optimistic in the face of adversity when things are going wrong, who can motivate, inspire, focus on what needs to be done next to get the outcome that you want. The third behavior is intellectual stimulation. Who are the problem solvers? Who are the players in the team that step up and come up with the tactical solution to solve the problem, the change in tactics to exploit the issues that the team are facing at that time. And then the fourth behavior is individualized consideration. I call that the coach carer, the person who supports members in the team when they're struggling, when they've made a mistake, who helps them get back on task straight away. And now those 4 behaviors are terrific leadership behaviors. And if we can identify those in our team, if we can have the awareness where people pop up to display that behavior and demonstrate that behavior, and then follow when someone else pops up to demonstrate his strength, his behavior, perhaps as a talking leader or as a role model. I don't think leaders necessarily have all of those leadership behaviors, but it's a good framework, particularly in my sport, in rugby, where I think that pop-up leadership and the leadership groups that Stuart may work with, they probably display a combination of those 4 behaviors.
Yeah, because it's obviously, it would be if you have one individual who is all of that, then happy days.
Right.
You really need everybody to have a little bit of it at different stages. Do you talk openly to the team about this? Do you actually sit them down and say, these are the 4 characteristics that we'd like you all to work on every little aspect of this, but there will be times when one of you is displaying this in a really specific manner, and then hopefully the rest of the team will identify that and pile in behind you, so that that's where the momentum of the group comes from?
If you can get that a collective understanding of players' strengths and why they are good at motivating or talking in the change room, good at solving problems, or I just follow him because he just does the right thing at the right time, displays the work ethic, demonstrates the work ethic. If they're aware of that, then I think that adds to the group. Nowadays, because we have to put, in the professional environment, we have to put deliberate attention on developing those leadership behaviors, identifying them, celebrating them, recognizing them, and developing them further, strengthening them in a team environment if we can.
That's a significant change over the last 10, 15 years, that you kind of feel like it's very important that whoever is coaching or managing teams identifies and develops that. Is that something that would have happened more organically up to that point?
Yeah, I think the amateur days of rugby and top-class rugby, perhaps in the amateur environment, where people had to lead themselves, didn't they, in their own job as a teacher, as a lawyer, as a doctor, as a banker, whatever job they had, they would have to manage their own working life and also develop themselves and manage their life as an elite sportsman, even though it was an amateur environment. And so I think we probably had a better understanding, a better awareness, a better development of our leadership skills then. And nowadays, in the professional environment where lots of things are done for players, we have to build their responsibility. We have to give them opportunities to lead. We have to give them feedback on their leadership so they can do it better next time. So I think we have to put far more deliberate attention in that certainly professional coaching environment on identifying and developing leadership capabilities.
Yeah, all that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of what we've been talking about a little bit over the course of this series, the last one.
Yeah, I think, Kev, just a question for you. So those 4 qualities, do you think it's possible for any one coach or any one leader to possess all 4, and the art of it really is then picking the right tool out of the box at the right time?
I think it's, if you've got all those 4 qualities and display those behaviors, I think that makes you, a really potential high-performing leader. I think that self-awareness, where you know your preference, you know your strength, and that ability then to lead and follow at the appropriate time is the key to it. Because we will all have certain strengths in certain areas. You would have done lots of personality profiles, and they are useful in highlighting that. But if we can raise awareness of it and aware of each other, then we get this leadership and fellowship at the right moment, dependent on the strengths of the individual at that moment in time.
Mm. We're talking a good bit here about the role of the coaches in developing the team. Your role specifically was helping the coaches to get better at developing their skill set in understanding how to communicate this to their teams. How did that come about? When did you understand that this was a role that was necessary for an organisation as big as the RFU, for example? And were you pushing an open door when you said, look, this is what we should be doing?
Yeah, I think in 2002, when I got appointed, I think I was probably the first head of elite coach development to be appointed in any sport. And so that was really quite forward thinking by the RFU performance director at that time. And he actually put a budget together to invest in the role and put a budget together to invest in helping our best coaches to be even better. Now, what impressed me in early days about Stuart was his hunger to learn, his openness to learning, his willingness to go anywhere and everywhere to learn. And he continues, with that approach now in order to be the best coach he possibly can be. So often in those early days, I would ask coaches, what would make you a better coach? And often the answer was, I don't know. What's on offer? So where do you go for learning? So I think we went to, a coach is a leader. There's no doubt about that. He's a leader of teams, of individuals, of units. And therefore, we went to the military and explored how they lead in the military. We went to exploration. Explorers leading from the front, leading from the back. We went to performing arts, the conductor of an orchestra with the virtuoso violinist who might be your talented outside half, and then the forwards are probably the orchestra in the background. But how do you create that music, that performance? We went to one company called Magic Management, which talked about perception and deception, and one coach really took that into his coaching, because often in back play and attack play, we are trying to deceive the opposition and fool them into doing one thing so that we can exploit the space elsewhere. So it was trying to think creatively about where we could take learning from other domains as well as other sports as well. We went to other sports and shared their development with to try to learn from them. But any domain that we could synthesize some learning from that domain that we could apply in the coaching environment of a professional rugby environment. So as long as people were able to, willing and able to do that, then I'm sure, well, I hope, they got a lot of development out of it.
Yeah, it sounds pretty exciting.
It's amazing, really.
Yeah.
When you go back a couple, I think, oh yeah, I remember that. And yeah, I mean, as a young coach, I mean, I was very lucky, but I was one of, you know, there was a team of say 14 academies, 14 academy managers, assistant academy managers, and the same is true in Ireland. You know, the academy manager of Leinster has just been away to Las Vegas on a leaders in performance conference. So, you know, it happens in Ireland as well, obviously. But at that time, as Kevin said, you know, the RFU were definitely leading the way in coach development, and I was just fortunate that I fell into that window, you know, between 2000 and 2010, 2011, obviously, when I stepped into the England role. So I'd had some great support throughout my time. And one thing that Kevin kept trying to develop, what he described as T-shaped coaches. So, Kev, I don't know if you want to explain to the audience what T-shaped coaches are.
Well, yeah. I think I've moved on from there now. It's about there's some great research about being a generalist specialist. So my T-shaped coach was the letter T, and the vertical part of the letter T was your depth of knowledge in a particular area. Now, it may be attack coaching, defense coaching, scrum coaching, but it's probably quite a narrow field of coaching or tactical knowledge. And the challenge would be to develop that depth of knowledge as far down, to be the all-knowing guru, the PhD in scrum coaching or whatever. The horizontal part of the letter T was the breadth of knowledge that the head coach needs. You need depth and breadth, obviously, but the breadth of knowledge across all tactical aspects of the game, but also about leadership, about management, about coaching process, about strength and conditioning, about planning, about periodization, about the mental skills involved. So all of a sudden, the head coach needs to know a little bit about everything. My wife's a PhD. If you talk to her about her PhD, it's a narrow field, and she knows everything about nothing, one might say. While I think coaching needs to know a little bit about everything, but don't tell her I said that.
It is interesting. You said you've moved on. How has your thinking evolved from the T-shaped coaching?
So there's a bit more. So the specialist coach is that depth of the vertical part of the T. The generalist is perhaps the horizontal. There is a theory now that says they merge, that you merge, that you develop your depth in such a number of areas that they eventually merge and they meet and you become a generalist specialist. So we often start with specialisms, and then you develop that general, that breadth and depth of knowledge in coaching in particular. And I think Stuart is, you know, it's not just experience that will give you that. It is opportunities to build your knowledge, your experience, your skills, your competencies to be a generalist specialist.
That's pretty interesting. When you're thinking about how putting together a coaching ticket, you want your scrum coach to be at the bleeding edge of what's happening in world scrums, but at the same time, they also have to know that the players are going to be tired at certain stages of the game. What do we do under those circumstances? That they're requiring for the players to be able to do other things is also huge. There might be games where there are no scrums. So,
I think there are certain people who gravitate towards those roles within coaching and in leadership. You're a specialist in one area, but when you become the head coach, you definitely need to be the generalist specialist, as Kevin's described, you know, or the leader of an organisation. You know, you can't know all the detail about everything that happens, the finance department, the commercial department,
Exactly.
but you have to have a good knowledge of everything. I guess I always gravitated towards that role that Kevin's just described, where, trying to learn as much about everything as I could, so that then I can either do it myself or challenge people who have been employed to do it. And so it was a staged process of developing my teaching ability through teaching, obviously. I went to teacher training college, taught, learned the fundamentals of how to communicate and teach and educate. Then the coaching came on top. Then the management part came on top of that. And then finally the leadership piece. And then obviously within that, you're actually practically doing it and you're learning on the job through success and failure, obviously.
Can I add to that, Stuart? Sorry, Chair. I think Stuart has talked about leadership, management, and coaching. And I think even the specialist Scrum coach has to display leadership, management, and coaching, because he has to sell the vision for the Scrum, the type of Scrum that he wants. He has to inspire his players to deliver that scrummage philosophy that he has a vision for. So he leads and directs as a leader. He manages the process of building the Scrum. He manages how they practice to achieve his vision of the Scrum. And he coaches by facilitating the learning of the individual players and the collective to achieve that vision that he set as a leader. So I think coaching in general involves leadership, involves management, and involves coaching in those three forms, and they overlap.
It sounds a little bit like when you're looking outside rugby and looking outside sport to find different ways of thinking, that it's a bit wild, and it must have been incredibly exciting to be at the very beginning of something like this. Can you pinpoint bits where you make great progress along the way in terms of your own coaching philosophy and in terms of trying to take ideas from somewhere else that you think, that leads you to the point where you realise the Scrum coach needs to have all of the leadership characteristics? If you were to look back now at the early parts of the noughties, for example, I did. That's when I got that, and I got a little bit from there. Can you pinpoint any of that for us?
I don't think there was a specific point. I think we really did try to think creatively and go to all domains, lessons from business and military exploration, performing arts, etc. I think there is a skill in coaches to information and apply it back into the coaching environment, the context that you're working in. And actually we honed back and brought it back to the business of rugby and coaching. We brought it back to the management of the coaching environment, the culture, the environment, the learning environment that you're trying to create. And I think we brought it back to coaching not just the player, but coaching the person was the journey and the evolution of it. And is it Brian Lahore who said, good people make good All Blacks, Stuart?
Yeah.
And in the end, I suppose, as a teacher, as a lecturer, as a coach developer, all I've been involved with is people development, whether they're young people, players, coaches, and that's the fundamental driver in the end. Whether it's business or sport, we're about developing people to be the best they can be, to sustain their career in coaching or in their job, in their business, to achieve the team goals, the company goals, the club goals.
It sounds simple when you put it like that, but that's why it's so difficult. Is that I don't know, because so many people do this badly and it doesn't work for them, or they get lost in the weeds of what they're supposed to be doing. But if you simplify it down to stuff like that, it's like, okay, I can follow that.
Yeah. And I think Kev deserves great credit for setting up the programme. I mean, I think the number of coaches that have been involved and influenced and improved by the systems and structure that Kev put in place. You know, you'd be talking hundreds, not tens, you know, hundreds of coaches who've gone through the level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5, as was, and been on Red Rose coaching programs and had opportunities to grow and form, you know, players who've gone to become coaches or become leaders, or people who've left rugby and gone into business or whatever else. You know, so it was an amazing time really in the RFU when we had this this group of talented academy managers, this group of hungry coaches who wanted to get better access to great learning opportunities. You know, and a lot of the guys who are my sort of academy generation have all gone on to become, you know, future head coaches or whatever. And you know, Kev deserves the huge amount of credit for that. And obviously, for me personally, I felt I was, because when I became the England coach, I felt I was the representation of all of that. You know, because it's very hard, as you see now, you know, for anyone to become an international coach without a track record of either international excellence or a pedigree of being a top-end player and you've won World Cups or whatever else. So for someone to come through the system I had, you know, I felt very much, I felt very responsible for doing that and supporting Kev, you know. And so whenever I had the opportunity as national coach, I would always try and attend coaching conferences or whatever to pass on what I've learned.
Was that in any way a burden at the time?
It wasn't a burden at the time, no, not in the slightest. But actually, one of the regrets I have over not staying on in the role with England and it finishing the way it finished was that it almost appeared that actually you can't, you know, perhaps this guy was too inexperienced and perhaps we needed someone else who could have done X, Y, or Z, and we should have gone for the whatever, you know, the overseas coach or the more experienced coach. And I felt it knocked, you know, coach development back a bit, you know, in the country. But it's reassuring now to see other young coaches coming through and, you know, potentially putting their hat in the ring as future England coaches. You know, I think about people like Exeter and Saracens, you know, the Alex Sandersons and the Ali Heifers of this world, who Kev's hugely played a role of, who are outstanding coaches. Gareth Southgate in football, obviously, in England, you know, he's come through a sort of player to coach development pathway, coached age grade football and became the England coach and has done really well. So, you know, I hope that the RFU and any other organisation listens to this and understands the importance of what people like Kev do and how important it is to develop. You know, it doesn't just happen. You don't just become a good coach. You need people to help you become a good coach.
It's the lifelong learning thing. You were obviously very open to what Kevin was doing. Was everybody else in your class as well at that point? Like,
I think there were. I think there were, you know, and I think back to, let's say, the guys who were academy managers at the time. You know, it wasn't just Kevin. I mean, Kevin would facilitate sessions, but we had great people like Brian Ashton who would come in and stimulate us about how to play. We were actually talking before that Kevin came on air, and we were chatting about the early ball game and the offloading game and how to keep the ball alive. There's no doubt people like Brian Ashton had a huge amount to play in developing all our philosophies. And so I think yeah, we were the first group of young professional coaches because we were the 33, 34-year-old academy managers.
Yeah, it's interesting because in professional football in England, there is that old players network and the managers who just go from job to job to job because they were successful at one point and they get on that carousel and they can't get off it. And there is a suspicion amongst that group of coach pathways and development and evolution, and there's a younger generation of managers who are getting those jobs finally in English football who are kind of pushing them out.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm on the technical advisory board for the Football Association, so we actually had a meeting last month at Wembley, and it was about coach development. So the new head of coach development in the Football Association in England is looking for ideas from outside of football, how they can grow leadership, and that's the step that the Football Association have taken in England. And you know, there's no coincidence that the age grade teams are doing better, the England senior team better, because football is now looked outside of football. And we had this really interesting debate about developing, you know, a Steven Gerrard or a Frank Lampard, or how are these guys going to learn? Because if they only ever learn from the former coaches, then we keep repeating the same process. And you know, in the technical advisory board, there's people like Sir Dave Brailsford and Matthew Syeds on there who writes the Times, who's written the book Black Box Thinking, and some great people in this technical advisory board. And you know, everyone was in agreement that, you know, if you could put a mentor from outside of sport or outside of the sport of football with a Gerrard or whatever, then you're going to get a huge return on your investment, I think. And the Football Association deserve credit for doing that. And I think that's where the RFU were ahead of the game, in my opinion. I was mentored through an RFU funded course by a head teacher of a school. And so we don't actually talk about rugby at all. He talked about managing his staff and, dealing with people, hiring, firing, dealing with discipline issues with the kids and everything else. And that was absolutely invaluable to me as a coach.
Really?
Yeah, huge. He had a really tough secondary school in a working class area in South Yorkshire, and he would come and say, he was supported by the RFU. He wanted to give something back. He was paid a little retainer for helping mentor me, and I would go and meet him 3 times a year, and we'd talk about anything but rugby. But talk about how do you get the best out of the demotivated, teacher in the corner, or how do you deal with a discipline issue, or how do you move someone on if you don't think they're good enough?
Was that Kevin's idea?
It was actually before Kevin started. It was an RFU invested program. It was a guy, Des Diamond, that set it up.
It's a bit mad when you think about it. Like, for somebody to come and say, yeah, we're going to get this guy who is on our pathway here, and we're going to have him talk to, and it's going to make him a better coach.
Yeah. And I was 29 at the time, 29, 30. So, but again, I'll make the point that part of the reason I perhaps got the opportunity is because I put myself forward to do the coaching awards. People look at the coaching awards, often go, I'm just going to tick the box to get my FA Pro license or whatever else, and it's just part of the process. If you go into any job or any award like that just thinking you're ticking a box, then I think you're doomed before you start. I used it as an opportunity, 1, to get the qualification, but 2, to develop my learning, which then opened the door to other learning.
Kevin, that is really interesting, that kind of looking outside other sports, that the FA are doing that now. When you were looking outside and beyond the performing arts and the business world, what did you learn from other sports that you were able to kind of come back straight away and go, yeah, rugby's going to benefit from that?
I think the professional sports at that time, because we were a new professional sport, had a lot to offer. Football is interesting because football often just did it their way. What's happened more recently is what Stuart was explaining there, is that football has opened up to learning from other sports and other domains. I work with the Premier League with some Premier League football academy coaches, and it's a personal development program. It's not a tactical knowledge isn't enough nowadays. It's those, the modern coach is a relationship manager. So it's about self-awareness, emotional awareness, emotional control, influencing others, communicating effectively, differentiating your approach to one player to the other player. So these are personal skills that are transferable across all domains. So going to sport and business and other domains for learning is important. Learning from other sports. Particularly team sports, I think, was relevant to rugby in particular, and that cooperation, that reliance, that collaborative nature of team sports, rather than just the individual sports. But the discipline. The athletic performance in a lot of the Olympic individual sports, there's great learning there as well, of course. But managing and helping, accelerating learning, managing athletes, an interdisciplinary approach to develop your players, your teams. There's great learning from other sports in those areas in particular.
What was your take on the whole issue of mentoring then as well? Because, it is really interesting to hear that somebody who is so left field really is still considered very valuable, nearly 2 decades on. I'm aging you prematurely, I think, decade and a half.
I think coaches need a network of support, and Stuart has a network of support that he would go to various people to think out loud with them on various areas of his coaching, his leadership, his management, I'm sure. And I think I would encourage anyone to explore. As I say, I prefer the thinking partner to the term mentor. It's sounding board. It's that that Yoda, that someone who can unlock an opportunity somewhere else, perhaps. So it's important to have a network of support on your journey of development, really.
Yeah, and it seems like it can be anybody. If you're open enough, it could literally be anybody who has a different way of looking at things, who might say something that sparks your thinking as opposed to telling you what to do.
I think the key is trust. Early days when our level 5 program, I think, Stuart, we linked with Ashbridge Management College, and we had some executive business coaches that we paired up with rugby coaches. Well, some hit it off and some didn't really. And I think the key to that support and challenge that a mentor, a thinking partner offers is trust. You have to have a relationship and trust someone who can hold the mirror up sometimes and show the warts and all in the consequences of your decisions, your actions, or what have you. But knowing that they are trusted to help you be the best you possibly can be.
Is this something you still do now at this stage of your career? Like, I mean, obviously you've got the field of people that you can speak to is much broader now, but do you benefit from these types of conversations with people still?
Yeah. I mean, you know, I had one on the way in to the studio with Owen Eastwood, who we interviewed. You know, he's just been to New Zealand. He's been speaking at a coaching conference. He met Wayne Smith there, the New Zealand coach. He's working with the FA, so we had a conversation about that. We had a conversation about, you know, so this was, you know, half an hour ago, because I had a half-hour journey in the car. So I thought, well, let's ring someone who, you know, there's another guy who Kevin introduced me to, a guy called Nick Bishop, who is the former Wales analyst, actually. He used to work with Graham Henry, who writes for a blog on a rugby website, who's the fountain of all knowledge for Southern Hemisphere rugby. So he's on the journey on the way back.
Are they purely transactional at this point, or are you giving as much as you're getting, saying, "Oh, look, we've seen this." And it's two ways.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I mean, they're as interested in my, you know, so you're staying at Leinster, or what's happening, or what happened with Ireland, or what do you think you're going to do over the next few weeks, or what you've been up to outside of rugby, and have you done any interesting work outside of sport? How did the FA thing go? And so yeah, it's very much like that. But also, I bumped into someone in the gym the other day who'd been listening to our podcast and said, "Listen, I've got this really good book. I thought you might be interested on the back of your podcast." Gave me the book, and I was like, "Bingo!"
Yeah, there you go.
So you know, it never stops. You know, I've been thinking about, you know, obviously for Leinster, you know, we want to continue to win. You know, we want to win after winning. So I've been doing some research into the Golden State Warriors and the NBA team and Steve Kerr, the head coach, and his philosophy on that. I found this great podcast that he's involved in, and so I've clipped a bit of that up, obviously, to play to the Leinster players after this weekend. And
he hosted his own show for a while. Steve Kerr would have.
That's right. Yeah, he was in the media, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Maybe this is the way you could go. Maybe there's a future coaching career.
There's an opening here. Well, he was also a pretty good basketball, I think, as a player, wasn't he? He was decent.
Yeah.
But look, we should talk about Steve Kerr again at some point, because if that's something, I think there's definitely a big interest in how coaches learn from each other and the little bits and how you siphon the bit of good information from bad information. Trust is obviously very important, but people will come to you with loads of information all the time, and you have to somehow decide good, rubbish, good, or more. Maybe it's more rubbish. Good, rubbish.
Yeah. I mean, the more experience you get, the more you learn to know what you need to improve. Does that make sense? So you get more clear about what are the areas I need to do improve, and you go in a specific area. When you're young, you tend to take on everything. I actually I found my old, I went home the weekend found my old bag with all my notes I used to make from all the leadership courses that Kevin put me on, and I created a book of quotes, which was all the best quotes I'd taken from every book I'd read, and then I'd sort of typed them all up, and it's like this huge, like, PhD of quotes. So I'm now sat there looking at it and reading all that again, and, you know, that's just refreshed my mind, and, you know, and I actually find, what I find really rewarding, and I don't know if it'd be interesting what Kev thinks, but helping people get better is a big part of what I enjoy about coaching, and whether it's passing on through this podcast, whether it's passing on to other sports, or passing on my book of quotes, you know, to you or whoever wants it. That's what I really enjoy, and I can see myself, you know, not now because I still want to coach, but doing what Kev does in the future. You know, maybe 10 years time, be a coach developer, because that would be the ultimate. That'd be the ultimate job for me beyond coaching a team.
Yeah. Well, we should publish that ring binder. What do you make of that, Kevin?
That's Stuart's hunger for learning, isn't it? It's absolutely terrific. I think there's a saying which says, leadership is always the problem, and leadership is always the solution. And to be the best leader you possibly can be, to develop yourself to can be, I think, is a credit to someone like Stuart, who is so committed to that. And my philosophy was sort of share and grow. If you share your knowledge, you'll probably get something back, and you'll grow as a result of it. And coaches only give a certain amount of time to their own development because they're so full on with their job. But if you can pull away, you see the problem from a different perspective. You know, it's often, you know, you can't see the wood from the trees, is the saying, isn't it? So if you pull away, if you go to a leadership, a coach development program, 70% is confirmation of what you do is pretty good. 20% you may discard, and that wouldn't work for me. But there may be a few little nuggets, that 10% of information that you will to your coaching leadership armory, which will help you get even better, I think.
Kevin, you've been a brilliant guest, and you've been very good with your time. You've been such a good guest, you didn't even mention the Wales Grand Slam, the victory of Wales over Ireland. I was going to bring it up at the start, but we got into it, so congratulations.
Thanks very much indeed. They're very proud of them. They did a good job, didn't they?
Yeah,
they did a job on Ireland, unfortunately.
They did some job. Look, we're not talking rugby here at all, but you must be feeling pretty confident about what's coming up in the World Cup.
Yeah, it will be very interesting. Yeah. How much of an indicator is this Six Nations on the World Cup? Because it will change. I think sport changes very quickly, and I think it'll be some interesting results in the World Cup, but it'll be fascinating watching as well.
Well, enjoy it, Kevin. You've been brilliant with your time, as I said. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thanks very much indeed. Cheers, Stuart. Good luck, mate. Bye-bye.
So that's this week's episode of Leaders' Questions. That was great.
Yeah.
Turns out the coaching evolution is a long-term, lifetime thing, and if you embrace it, wherever you're finding that extra 10% of that little nugget.
Yeah, I think also the one thing that often happens as well is it's often the learning you take place in the bar afterwards, or the bit in between, you know, when you go on these conferences. And you know, I'm pleased that, you know, Kev obviously left the RFU not long after I left, actually, but he's now employed as a consultant in many sports. Obviously, he's got part retirement on his mind as well, which is good for him. But I'm pleased he had the vehicle through this, you know, leadership series to talk, because I think you can't underestimate the influence he's had on coaches in England in particular, but now in Wales, obviously. And, you know, I owe him a huge amount.
Good stuff. We'll be back with another Leaders' Questions same time next week. Best of luck.
Leaders' Questions with Gilroy and Stuart Lancaster.
In association with Goal.
From Off the Ball.